On my recent Analogue Pocket review, I got this question. Would you rather play games on the Pocket or on the original hardware with the modded screen? Well, this got me thinking, is the Analogue Pocket actually a better gaming experience than the original hardware, albeit with some modifications? I have two modified Game Boys. One is a modified Game Boy Color and one is a modified Game Boy Advance. Let's start with the Game Boy Advance. I brought this pre-modified from an eBay seller. It has a new shell, it has new buttons, it's got new switches, and most importantly for a Game Boy Advance, it has a new backlit IPS display. And to be honest, I just don't like playing on this thing at all. First of all, the shell is a rubberized soft touch matte finish. I don't like it. It shows all of your fingerprints and any other kind of marks really easily. It also feels really cheap. It's got a bunch of inaccuracies compared to the original shell, which I kind of get because of copyright and all the rest of it, but it's just not good. Secondly, the buttons. They don't have the same kind of feel as the original Game Boy Advance. Again, they feel cheap and they're kind of more domed out than the original ones, as well as being slightly taller. The D-pad is both stiff and mushy at the same time and is just no match for the original. The shoulder buttons are equally as mushy as the D-pad and they don't have that same clicky tactile feel as the originals. And to make things even worse, the left one quite often sticks. There are various other bits and bobs I don't like about the shell, but suffice it to say, at some point the screen will be coming out and going back into an original shell. For comparison, I still have my 20-plus-year-old original Game Boy Advance that I bought at launch, and this thing still feels amazing. All that said about what I don't like about this, the screen is still great and is even better than the SP model. I've only got a 001, but I suspect this would also be better than the 101 model. Ultimately, the only thing I really don't like about the original Game Boy Advance is that screen. It's not backlit, so it's really difficult to see. You used to have a worm light or be under a big light. You know, that's the only thing that I don't like about it. Personally, I'm not a big fan of the SP's clamshell design. I find it to be really cramped when you're playing it and it's just not my bag. The shoulder buttons are tiny and it's just not for me. I much prefer that original landscape orientation of the Game Boy Advance. Now I do also have a DS Lite, which is capable of playing Game Boy Advance games through the slot on the bottom. This has the much needed backlit display that the Game Boy Advance doesn't, and it is also in landscape with the correct ratio screen. However, currently the handheld of choice for playing Game Boy Advance games is the Analogue Pocket, despite everything I said about preferring the landscape orientation for those games because they have a 3:2 aspect ratio and this has a 4:3. It's just better. So for Game Boy Advance games currently this is the handheld of choice. So what about Game Boy and Game Boy Color games? Well, that's slightly different. The Game Boy Color I have features a new shell and a laminated backlit IPS display. The modifications for this Game Boy were carried out by me. Initially, I just wanted to change the shell on an old Game Boy Color that I bought second hand. However, as soon as I started looking for shells, then I went down the rabbit hole of other mods that you could do, and obviously the next logical step for a Game Boy or a Game Boy Color is to get a backlit screen. Not long after I started looking into replacement screens came the release of the funny playing Q5 laminated panel, and as soon as I saw that, I ordered one, and this thing is awesome. Having already purchased and fitted this shell, and to be honest was really happy with it, I didn't want to go and order a different shell that was designed to accept the Q5 panel, which, if you're unfamiliar with the Q5 display, is actually slightly bigger than the original and requires a little bit of modification to a standard shell in order to fit, which I decided I would carry out myself. It's a bit of a tight squeeze, and it did require a fair amount of cutting away from the shell to make it fit, but I'm actually really pleased with the result. And the quality of this shell compared to this one, I really wanted to keep it now that I had it. The shell that I ordered actually came with replacement buttons and switches as well, but I opted to keep the original hardware so that I could keep the original feel. And it really worked. It feels just like the original, and apart from this slightly annoying rattle from the battery cover, this thing is awesome to play on. So does that mean I prefer to play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games on this modified Game Boy Color? Well, quite often, yes. I can't say I haven't played a fair amount of Game Boy and Game Boy Color games on this Analogue Pocket, but I do find myself reaching quite often for this thing to get that original feel. I love the size of the handheld, and I love the form factor. That bump on the back, it just fits perfectly in my hands, which aren't that big. And when it comes to screens, the Analogue Pocket might have a size advantage, but the Game Boy Color with the Q5 panel definitely can compete in sharpness and brightness. Now, the Analogue Pocket does have a few extra tricks up its sleeve when it comes to different filters that you can put on to change the color of the screen and add scan lines and things like that. But to be honest, I don't really mess with that stuff all that often. In conclusion, the Analogue Pocket is the best handheld that I currently own for cartridge-based systems. And whilst I may prefer to use the original hardware when it comes to Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, I am currently using the Analogue Pocket when it comes to Game Boy Advance games. As for other systems, I haven't quite decided yet. Maybe the Vita's better. If you find yourself on the fence as to whether to order an Analogue Pocket or modify an original Game Boy, Game Boy Color or Game Boy Advance system, then you might end up where I was. And what did I do? Both. You see, one bit I left out of the story earlier on is that whilst I was waiting for the Analogue Pocket to deliver, that's when I modified the Game Boy Color. Which, if you've watched my previous Analogue Pocket video, you will know that is one of the reasons not to buy one. You have to wait ages to actually get your hands on one of these things. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.